Welcome to the 11th episode of the Sydney Contrarian, titled The Truth Behind the Australian Federal Budget and Government Debt. Now, the Federal Treasurer, Scott Morrison, released the federal budget of 2017 on Tuesday the 9th of May. The federal budget details how the government has performed financially in the past year and how they plan to allocate funds for the coming year in terms of social welfare, jobs creation, defense and military, health, education, foreign aid, and public infrastructure. The federal budget also provides the public with information relating to the state of the government's finances and how this may affect the taxes we pay and what benefits may be increased or cut. Now, looking more closely at the details, I find that they have again presented yet another set of not so flattering numbers, and then they go forth to place emphasis on promises of a rosier future. This is more of the same from the past so many years. Well, the federal government might as well be more upfront and help the general public understand the true state of the budget by simply playing this clip.
We are screwed.
Hey, I don't want to hear that defeatist attitude. I want to hear you upbeat.
We are screwed.
There you go.
Tongue-in-cheek aside, this video is going to go into some of the government budget's details in terms of the government forecasts on the future economic conditions, and we're going to line it up with the economic data and the financial markets as well as the job markets that we know from official agencies, and also with looking at what's actually happening if you actually go out in the streets. We will see that the government's narrative does not line up. And what's even more concerning is if you look deeper, they really don't have our back for the upcoming financial and economic crash. In terms of how I'm going to go about this, I'll refer to an excellent overview by Greg Jericho of The Guardian. He provides a nice breakdown of the government's financial position, their cash flow, their trade balance, and I'm also going to add to it some personal analysis of my own based on my understanding of the current markets and also the global economy as a whole. So let's visit the federal budget website, and as you click into the site, you'll be greeted with this page informing you of the federal budget, detailing the government's past achievements and goals. The budget is the government's plan for stronger growth to deliver more and better paying jobs, guaranteeing the essential services that Australians rely on, tackling cost of living pressures, and ensuring the government lives within its means. These are rather lofty promises, and they cannot truly be delivered in the current age. In fact, they are mutually exclusive. To deliver more and better paying jobs require the Australian economy to not be burdened by too much public and private debt, since debt stifles investment and expansion. If you borrow too much, you have to end up paying interest, and interest comes out of productivity. So if you borrow too much, you end up paying off most of the fruits of your labors as interest rather than growing the economy. So moving on to the next part, to provide the essential services to Australians that they have enjoyed for so long, including Medicare, public education, public health care, and government age pension, you have to also consider the fact that we have an aging population, which means more working individuals are going to be taxed, and there's less of them, so it reduces their disposable income, which also means that they're going to have to borrow more. And then this further links to the fact that the government wanting to live within its means, well, if they want to do that, they've got to cut down on some services that are considered essential in the past, when we had more people working than those who are retired or on welfare payments. So basically, the government's making promises which sound great, but within 2 minutes, you can actually see it really doesn't work. let us look more closely at the key figures and understand what is really happening. The government over the years has programmed us via the mainstream media to believe that the government's success in managing their finances is balancing the budget. In other words, if they spend less than what they earn in tax revenue, which means they're in a surplus position, then mission accomplished. So year after year, the focus is balancing the budget or getting the budget back in surplus. However, this is not even close to what the government should be achieving, which is the government should get itself out of debt or to reduce debt to start off with. But let's play along with them just to see the absurdity of what's going on. So since the subprime crisis that began in late 2007, the government has reported deep budget deficits to the amount of $20 billion annually. The Rudd government, the Gillard government, the Abbott government, and the Turnbull government have invariably spent more than they have received, to the tune of over 1.5% of annual GDP every year for the past 9 budget years. However, they'll always say that they'll reach a surplus in a few years' time. In fact, Treasurer Scott Morrison is expecting the budget deficit to halve in the coming year and to enter a surplus by 2020. The government has had a bad track record of predicting when they'll enter into a budget position. And I mean, I've heard this for so many years. Back in 2012, the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, forecasted we'll be in a budget surplus this year. Except if you look at the history, well, it doesn't sound that good. In 2014, the federal budget delivered by Joe Hockey forecasted our deficit for this year, 2017, to be 0.6% of the GDP. Well, that increased to 1.3% in the following year. By 2016, it was 1.6%. And we hit 1.6%. If you look at the government's revenue relative to expenditures, the orange line that is the government's revenue has not exceeded the government's expenses shown by the blue line since 2008. In other words, the government has been in a deficit. And in the recent 3 years, the government revenue has increased, likely due to increases in the Medicare levy, capital gains tax on property sales, and also the fact that they've moved some of the operating expenses into capital expenses and basically doing a bit of fudging of the numbers so that we look like we are in a better position. But in all honesty, it really doesn't make a difference. What is alarming though, if you look at the forecast, is the assumption that the government revenue will increase in the years to come to exceed government expenses which they expect to remain flat. However, it is optimistic because if you look carefully, it is actually extrapolating the growth of the operating cash revenue, as in the income, over the past 3 years to extend the next 3 years. This is a bit optimistic because the Australian economy is actually weakening and the global economy is even weaker. If you look at the government predictions, they are quite contradictory. Looking at wage growth over the past 3 years especially, they have been falling. In the budget year ended 2015, wage growth was expected to be 3% per annum, and that was achieved. Then for 2016, it fell to 2.75%, and for this year, we experienced a wage growth of 2.5% per annum. So as wage growth is slowing down in actual fact, the government expects revenue to grow in the future even though in the past few years it has slowed down. Governments receive revenue through taxing people out of their wages and capital gains. So sure, you could say that capital gains, that's where they're getting a lot of their revenue because house prices have been going up. But a lot of people who are invested in property are doing so through negative gearing, and which means that their interest payments exceed their rental income, so the government's actually receiving less taxes from these property investors, and a lot of them are not really selling their houses, or if they do so, their capital gains are sometimes halved if they hold it for more than a year, if I remember correctly. Or maybe 6 years. Someone will have to fact check that one. But either way, it just does not add up when they say wage growth is down, but we're going to expect that government revenue is going to go up. The GDP, or the economic productivity, has also followed a similar pattern. Even when the subprime crisis hit the world in 2007-2009, the GDP growth in Australia was 3 to 4%, and it dipped in the year ended 2010 to just around 3% before recovering. But from 2012 onwards, GDP growth fell invariably from 3.8% to 2% in the most recent budget. That's a 50% fall, and it's only 2% growth this year. Now, putting this together, our domestic productivity and wage growth have fallen substantially, and the government's deficit widened as the government tried to inject more capital in the economy to spur growth, but failing. And the pace of economic growth has slowed. So what puzzles me the most, and it should puzzle you, is the government's forecast of the GDP and wage growth and their budget position. They expect wage growth to increase monotonically to approach 4% in the next 4 years. The expected trend is actually a mirror opposite of the past 4 years if you look carefully. Despite the fact that the current economic data and business conditions do not support this type of forecast, it makes no sense. The government's forecasts contradict the current conditions, and yet it is still pushed forward as a narrative to accept. The mainstream media seems to play along with it, and this really concerns me. So moving along to some financial market data, we'll start with the government bond yields and the Reserve Bank of Australia's 24-hour cash rate. As said before, and you should watch episode 1 and episode 2, the RBA sets the interest rate thinking that they can target an inflation hoping to keep it within a range of 2 to 3% to maintain price stability. However, this is the reverse of how a market should work, which is by the forces of supply and demand. They should set their own interest rates by the demand and supply of credit and loans. The RBA has generally moved interest rates down since the subprime crisis, and in the except for a short period between 2010 to 2011 or so when they raised interest rates. But that quickly turned around as the mining investment boom ended and the economy began to continue to further slow down, and interest rates have fallen to record low at 1.5%. You could see that government bond yields have fallen similarly. Now, this is an important thing to keep in mind. Interest rates have fallen to below 2%, which is what the RBA wants to target as the inflation. So when government bonds are yielding less than 2%, and even the 10-year government bond yields are less than 2%, investors are making a negative real return, as in they're losing purchasing power during this time. People who are putting their cash in a bank deposit are receiving about 1.65%, so they're automatically losing about 0.3-0.4% of their purchasing power. How could you say that the economy is growing when people's real wealth or their purchasing power is declining? So instead of saying that the RBA is spurring growth, and you can see that by the continual decrease in the bond yields, at least a trend, they have contributed to weaker economic growth and also prospects of weaker economic growth because it does not encourage investment. It encourages spending or consumption and also borrowing, but it certainly is not encouraging productive investments. When interest rates are low, it encourages borrowing, and there is interest being charged on loans. And as I said before earlier, interest payments detract from productivity, as it's simply an amount that is earned on a liability. It produces no real tangible growth. So the economy currently is weighed down by increasing amount of debt, and therefore a greater amount of productivity is being drained through interest payments. So one may actually rightly suggest that the RBA has stifled economic growth as they rely on an accommodative monetary policy through reducing interest rates that created more debt, channeling our economy to pay the creditors instead of producers. Moving to commodity prices, we can actually see that the global economy is further slowing down. And given that Australia relies much on exports of our commodities and our natural resources, this is going to point to why the government and central banks around the world, especially Australia, are fighting a losing fight to spur inflation and economic growth. Firstly, commodity prices, especially that of oil, determines the cost of production, and therefore it feeds through to price levels and wages around the world. Oil prices have fallen from $100 a barrel in 2014 to below $60 a barrel for most of the past 3 years, and even fell as low as $27 a barrel in early 2016. As oil prices fall, the input costs are going to fall, wage growth is going to fall, and therefore inflation is going to be weak. Now, with inflation being weak, you can expect that wages are also not going to go up too much, as companies are receiving a lower amount. It might cost them less to produce, but they're also watching prices go up slower. So therefore, it does not actually lead to them wanting to raise wages. At the same time, given that with oil prices falling a lot, it might be a good thing, but this is not true. The reason is, as oil prices have been in a high level for for the first 4 years of this decade, a lot of oil producing companies dug up expensive shale oil in order to generate profit. But when oil prices have fallen below $60, most of these companies who have borrowed to the hilt to produce this oil, they're actually extracting oil now at a loss, and they still got massive debt to pay. Now, who are the creditors? The banks. And if the banks are not going to receive the loan repayments, then there is a destruction of credit, because those companies are going to be put into administration, and with that happening, there will be massive layoffs, and there's been massive layoffs in across Canada and the US in the coal and oil industries. Capital is going to be written off, and as people lose their jobs, there's going to be a lower demand for consumption, which feeds into a vicious cycle, because households can't repay their debt, and then banks face further bad debt. So the subprime crisis and the way governments and central banks have handled the crisis with more debt and lower interest rates have caused this vicious cycle to continue. So for them to say that things are fine now, and to make their forecasts of things being rosy in the future, is cognitive dissonance. And last but not least, what really matters is the government debt level. What I believe the government has gotten right about their forecasts is the level of government debt that they're going to have in the future. It's currently over $300 billion, but if you look at the government debt since the subprime crisis, they have risen exponentially and almost coincides with the RBA reducing interest rates. While the RBA claims that they're an independent and non-political institution, the proof should be in the pudding. Their actions have been correlated with record growth in government debt, And I have not even gotten started about the corporate and household debt, which are moving in a similar trend. If the RBA is truly non-political, then it's incompetent as it has accommodated so much borrowing, yet failed to deliver growth for the economy which they promised. The government and the mainstream media have been hoodwinking us by focusing on balancing the annual budget, but not on the growing government debt. In other words, they want us to think that the government is successful in managing their finances if they're able to receive more than they spend in a particular year. However, that's a distraction from what really matters. Even if they receive more than they spend, there is a huge mountain of debt that needs to be repaid. I hope at this stage, if you're still watching this video, you can now see the dire situation of government's finances and hence why we cannot rely on the government to keep the economy propped up and for us to rely on them giving us generous benefits as they have in the past. You need to consider relying more on yourself and being prepared by reducing your personal loans, ensuring that your job skills are portable, and also having some precious metals on hand. The ride ahead could be a wild one when the governments and central banks cannot hold things together anymore. And when is this going to happen? The day and the hour are unknown, but it is imminent. Well, that's it from the Sydney Contrarian. Stay tuned for a future episode. Once again, God bless.